So at the present, there are several different levels of interaction that we might examine discretely or separately, starting with the political one, because that is the one that is the most obvious, the most emphasized in the media, and the most conflictual, even though it too is not entirely conflictual. And I could indeed spend the rest of the time lecturing about the recent history and political system of the world in a way which is the way that I view it from what I have studied of history, and it is very revisionist compared to what most people would probably conceive of from their history books and social studies books. But nevertheless, it's what I think is correct, so I will have to state it. And that is that often history books, especially in their use of maps, which is a very interesting part of history books and their studies, historical atlases and so on, they're viewed as nice because you have the thing graphically portrayed geographically, and often students' knowledge of geography is very poor, and so if one can cultivate that, it really helps to get a better grasp of history, to cultivate geography and geographical relationships. But another aspect of maps is maps lie. There's a demonstration in the hall about that on that equal area projection, which has at the bottom some Mercator projections and shows how grossly inaccurate the Mercator projection is, and really very terribly distorting geographical facts. Well, the historical map distortions consist of several aspects, one of them being that empires are always shown at their maximum extent. One of the things as an ancient historian that always drives me up the wall is these maps that show the Roman Empire under Trajan, which shows Iraq and Armenia as part of the Roman Empire. And they were never part of the Roman Empire. Trajan marched in and for all of 2 years occupied those areas. And then when he died, Hadrian withdrew the troops, and that was that. Now, I ask you, if it was a 2-year military occupation of an area sufficient to regard that as part of an empire? If that's the case, we ought to portray the United States at its greatest extent, showing Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Panama as part of the United States when those countries were occupied by American troops. And yet, that's never the way we view it, see? So there's a very great inaccuracy in that exaggerates the size of the Roman Empire somewhat. And fortunately, other maps exist that don't do that, but nevertheless, that's a very clear case. Now, another case is you have the Egyptian Empire in ancient pharaonic Egypt, say under the 18th dynasty, about 3,500 years ago or a little bit less, occupying Egypt, the northern Sudan, and Syria, Palestine, up to the Euphrates River. And this is portrayed as a map. So, with our modern mentality, we think of map, European countries, or United States and states on map, effective government, single governmental system, unitary state. And of course, such an Egyptian empire never existed. Egyptian garrisons and governors were never placed in Syria. The Egyptian army simply marched up to the Euphrates in the famous 17 campaigns of Thutmose III and marched back. The kings of the area, fearing that the Egyptians would come back for retribution, sent tribute. So they were tributary states to the empire of the metropole, that is Egypt itself, but they were not part of an empire in the sense of a modern state. And that is not conveyed by the map at all, and it's a terrible distortion that that is the case. Because Egypt never, as an organized kingdom, extended beyond the territory between Aswan and the Mediterranean. That was it. It was the kingdom of Egypt for all of its historical period because it was like an island and it couldn't extend its power anywhere beyond that effectively. Now this has relevance in the modern world because if we think of ancient empires, Now, even the Roman Empire, which was very highly developed bureaucratically for an ancient empire, where there were actually Roman governors and Roman officials in the various provinces and places, there was effective taxation and so forth, so you could consider it a proto-modern state in those respects. Yet it was far less effective, far less intrusive in private lives than a modern state is. And consequently, again, portraying the Roman Empire on the map has a little bit of element of doubtfulness when you compare that with a modern state, because the two are just simply not cognates of each other, not exactly. So that brings up the question of the modern political arrangements in the world and how they have evolved in recent times. Our portrayal of modern history, which is based on Europe and Europeans as actors and all other people in the world as either inert or obstinate obstacles to progress or innocent victims of imperialism. These are the two theories, which are both two sides of the same coin. That is, in either case, the colonized peoples are denied their role as actors in the world. So we have a situation where the Europeans are basically actors. And if one just looks at the political map of the world, it's very difficult to say anything else about it in a period like the 19th century, when the European countries were going conquering everywhere else and imposing their colonial rule on the other in various places. It's hard to conceive of the other people as actors in that sense anyway, maybe even in their own local histories to this day. The European intrusion is a very big, important theme in the world's history of those times. But generally, the idea is that the first spark of freedom, and indeed, according to one of the writers about the subject, a political scientist, the first spark of nationalism is the revolutions of Latin America against the Spanish and Portuguese rulers and the independence of the Latin American countries. And that kind of serves as a model for the much, much later post-World War II independence of the African and Asian countries. So we have this idea of independence. And we have in the United Nations the idea of the theoretical equality of all the members of the United Nations, one country, one vote, which admittedly is a concession from the large states to the smaller. After all, if the Seychelles Islands or whatever, Singapore has a vote equivalent to the United States of America, which has hundreds of times as many people and so forth, then that is a concession by the major powers to the minor states, perhaps something along the lines of the US Senate, where states like Vermont and Wyoming and Alaska, you have two senators like California, which has not 100 times as many people, but close to it. It would have something on the order of 70 times as many people as Wyoming. And so it might be a kind of concession on that order. But still, there's some idea of equality in that each national flag flies in alphabetical order in front of the United Nations building and so on. And some nativist nationalists in the United States resent that because they think, oh, the United Nations is just a waste of money. Oh, why, the United States has hardly any influence. Why should it foot a quarter of the bill? And anti-UN type of thing. And the idea, nevertheless, that each country is an independent sovereignty and that its independence means that it has a kind of equivalence of the political freedom that individual humans have in the United States under its Constitution is a prevalent idea. And at one time, there was more sense to regarding things that way. Now, if we look at Arnold Toynbee's scheme of history and how a civilization, a discrete civilization in its development, starts out as a constellation of city-states or of small states. In the case of Europe, of territorial kingdoms, say, in the early modern period, which once they had gotten rid of feudal lords and had formed national states, They were competing states that were fighting each other and at war with each other until, according to Toynbee, one of them delivers the knockout blow, and then at that point establishes a universal empire that rules over, lords over, and controls everything effectively. And in the case of the Chinese states, there was the period of contending states before the Han Empire was founded, where the Qin, the state ruled by the first emperor, which was a marginal geographic state at the frontier fringes of China, went back into the center, conquered the center, and established the Chinese Empire and the unified state, which has not ceased to be a unified state till this point. Or in the Greco-Roman world, the constellation of Greek city-states and then Hellenistic kingdoms was replaced by, at least in the Mediterranean area, a universal Roman Empire that controlled and dominated everything. So by Toynbee's model, one would expect European history to follow this same path, and I think now in the year 2000 it is secure to say that it has done so.